Today we are looking at a case from the mid-18th century, so sit back as we go to England. Elizabeth Jeffries was born in the year 1727 in the town of Bridgnorth in the English county of Shropshire. It was a small, peaceful place located in the Severn Valley. However, Elizabeth did not stay there very long. Instead, following the death of her father when she was just 5 years old, Elizabeth was adopted by her uncle, a wealthy butcher named Joseph Jeffries. He owned a large house in Walthamstow, which at the time was in the county of Essex, just a few miles to the east of London. Mr. Jeffries provided his niece with a lovely home, a good education, and made sure that she learnt all the social graces befitting a young lady in the mid-18th century. When she was about 15 years old, Mr. Jeffries declared that Elizabeth would be his housekeeper and take charge of the staff. But although he favoured her, he also took advantage of her poor position and abused her in a manner not appropriate of an uncle or a gentleman. Mr. Jeffries did not have any children of his own, so in his will made Elizabeth the sole beneficiary. He had quite a substantial estate, and one day young Elizabeth would be very wealthy indeed. However, Mr. Jeffries had become concerned about his niece's behaviour. She was rebellious, and it had been rumoured that she had been seen in the presence of young men. Mr. Jeffries told her that if she did not change her ways and started behaving like a respectable young lady, he would change his will in favour of another. Elizabeth was becoming quite tired of her uncle. His controlling nature and the unwanted attention he bestowed on her was something that she wanted very much to rid herself of. By now she was a young woman of 21 years of age, and she had started a relationship with her uncle's gardener, a young man named John Swan. Elizabeth was aware that if her uncle found out about the relationship with the gardener, he would dismiss John Swan and would probably disinherit her. He may even ask her to leave his house, which would mean that she and John would both have to seek employment and find somewhere else to live. And as London was a dirty, overcrowded city, her prospects would be limited, so Elizabeth and John hatched a plan. At around 3 o'clock in the morning of Saturday the 3rd of July 1751, residents of Wood Street in Walthamstow were awakened by the sound of screaming. It very much sounded like a young lady was in distress. A gentleman named Mr. Edward Buckle immediately arose from his bed and went to see what was happening. He went to the dimly lit streets, where he found Miss Elizabeth Jeffries. She was somewhat agitated and dressed in only her nightgown. When she saw Mr. Buckle, she shrieked, "Oh, they have killed him! They have killed him, I fear! Go see my uncle! They have killed him, I fear!" Mr. Buckle then made his way into her uncle's house. He was met by Mr. John Swan, who said, "Go and see my master, who I fear some cruel rogue has killed." Mr. Buckle then proceeded to the bedroom of Mr. Joseph Jeffries. The poor man was in a very bad way. He was lying on his right side, and blood was coming from his head. He was drifting in and out of consciousness. Mr. Buckle tried to speak to him, but Mr. Jeffries was unable to respond. John Swan rode out to fetch a doctor, and a neighbour ran to inform the constable. When the doctor, a gentleman named Mr. Thomas Forbes, arrived, he examined Mr. Jeffries. He found that he had wounds consistent with being shot and stabbed. It seemed that whoever had attacked him had wanted him dead. Dr. Forbes tried to make him as comfortable as possible, but he knew that he was unlikely to recover. The following day, without ever being able to speak of the incident, Mr. Joseph Jeffries died. Elizabeth had told the constable that her uncle had been attacked by an intruder whose attempt to rob the property had not gone as planned. She told him that some items of value were missing, including a silver cup, a tankard, and 15 pewter plates. However, following an inspection, the constable had found no sign of a forced entry into the house, and the maid had not witnessed anything untoward. She had certainly not heard anyone creeping around in the early hours of the morning. The constable thought that something did not seem quite right. He spoke to Elizabeth and John Swan, who both seemed quite troubled. It was, however, strange that neither could really say what they were doing when the supposed intruder had entered the house, shot and stabbed the master, and then escaped with some items of value. and although Elizabeth had appeared to be quite distressed, it was now John Swan who was particularly agitated. The constable took both Miss Elizabeth Jeffries and Mr. John Swan into custody, but there was not really any evidence against them, so they were soon discharged. Elizabeth would now be able to inherit her uncle's estates. For some strange reason, however, Elizabeth told the magistrates that she believed that one of her uncle's former employees, a man named Mr. Thomas Matthews, may have been responsible for the crime. Mr. Matthews had travelled to London from the port town of Hull the previous week in order to look for work, when he had the misfortune to meet Mr. John Swan and Mr. Joseph Jeffries while on the road walking through Epping Forest. Mr. Swan asked him where he was heading, and after a brief conversation offered him work as an assistant gardener. He said that he would not be able to pay him, but instead he could work for only his food and lodging. Mr. Matthews was quite a simple man, but he was honest and hard-working, and was in need of a place to stay, so he accepted John Swan's offer. 4 days later, however, Mr. Jeffries dismissed him. There was clearly a motive, and the magistrate ordered that Mr. Thomas Matthews be found. The newspapers reported the crime, and a gentleman named Mr. Gall, who owned a pub in the East End of London, remembered that there were two men who seemed to be very much like the two men described that had spent some time in his pub a few days earlier. He had particular cause to remember them, as not only were they both very drunk, but one had challenged another man to a fight. When the man threw his coat onto a chair, Mr. Gall had noticed he was carrying 2 pistols in his pockets. He took them and sent for the night watchman. Both men were then arrested. They were, however, released soon after, as their bail was paid by Miss Elizabeth Jeffries. Mr. Gall also told the magistrates, but the following day, Elizabeth had come to his establishment and rather shyly told him the pistols were in fact the property of her uncle. She explained that she had found herself in unfortunate circumstances and owed money to a certain person. The pistols were being used as nothing more than security for the debt. She added that she had taken the pistols without the knowledge or consent of her uncle and had instructed the 2 men, Mr. Matthews and Mr. Swan, to deliver them. She had given them money, but instead of doing as she had asked, they had spent the money in his pub. Mr. Gall said that she pleaded with him not to repeat this, as she did not want to bring shame onto herself or her family. It was now becoming increasingly more important to find Mr. Thomas Matthews, and constables all over London were put on alert to apprehend him. Eventually he was seen near the centre of the city. He was arrested and taken to the magistrates, although when questioned, Mr. Matthews told a very different tale. He said that he had met Mr. John Swan and Mr. Jeffries while on the road travelling through Epping Forest, and that Mr. Swan had offered him work at the home of his master, and not having any place to stay, he was happy to accept the proposal. He said that he worked hard, and after only a few days, Miss Elizabeth Jeffries asked him if he would like to earn £100. Of course, he replied that he would, but only in an honest way. He had no desire to break the law. Miss Jeffries then instructed him to return to the garden and seek out Mr. Swan. He did this, and Mr. Swan told him that if he would knock the old master on the head, he would pay him £700. Mr. Matthews added that by this time Miss Jeffries had entered the garden and told him that she would not have a moment's peace while the old miser was living. Mr. Matthews said that he replied to Mr. Swan and Miss Jeffries that he would not do such a thing. 2 days later, the master, Mr. Joseph Jeffries, dismissed him from his employment. He then planned to go to the centre of London to seek honest work. However, he was again apprehended by Mr. Swan, who gave him a guinea and asked him to purchase 2 pistols. He agreed to do this, but instead of buying the pistols, he spent the money drinking in a nearby pub. He met Mr. Swan again, who was quite angry, but together they went to try and buy the pistols. Pistols and guns in the 1750s were not widely utilised. They were heavy and quite unreliable in their functioning and were known to rust. The slow process for loading meant that it was a weapon that could not easily be relied upon if someone suddenly had to defend themselves. At the time, pistols were mainly used by smugglers, robbers and highwaymen, in circumstances more designed as a threat than an actual weapon. But if John Swan was intent in killing his master, a pistol would have been an effective way of doing it. Mr. Matthews went on to tell the magistrates that after he and Mr. Swan had acquired the pistols, they returned to the Green Man and Bell pub in London's East End where they continued to drink. At around 11 p.m, Mr. Swan challenged a man to a fight. He threw his coat over a chair, and it was noticed by the landlord that there were 2 pistols in the pockets. The landlord then took the coats and called the night watchman, who arrested them both and took them to jail. They were later released following the payment of bail by Miss Elizabeth Jeffries. Asked what he did next, Mr. Matthews said that he accompanied Miss Jeffries and Mr. Swan to a pub named the Buck Inn, which was very close to the home of Mr. Joseph Jeffries, and there they discussed a plan to rid the mistress of her uncle. He went on to say that late at night, on Friday the 2nd of July 1751, he returned to the property of Mr. Joseph Jeffries. The back entrance had been left unbolted, so he quietly opened the door and made his way to the pantry. Some cold beef had been left there for him, which he gladly ate. Sometime after midnight, Mr. Swan and Miss Jeffries came down the stairs, and Mr. Swan whispered, "Now it's time to knock the old miser, my master, on the head." Miss Jeffries had already removed some items of value and hidden them in a sack in the cellar in order to make it seem like there had been an intruder in the house. However, when the time arrived, Mr. Matthews informed the magistrate that he was unable to commit this terrible crime. He said that he looked at Mr. Swan and told him that he could not find it in his heart to do it. The magistrate asked what happened next, and Mr. Matthews replied, "Miss Jeffries quietly shrieked, 'You may be damned for a villain, for not performing your promise.' And Mr. Swan said that he had a mind to blow my brains out for the refusal to shoot the master." Mr. Matthews continued. He said that Mr. Swan made him swear that he would never disclose what was about to happen. He said that he replied that he would not, unless his life was in danger. John Swan then took the pistols and went upstairs. Mr. Matthews said that when he heard the shots, he quickly left the house. He crossed the river and went towards the area of Enfield Chase. The magistrate believed that Mr. Thomas Matthews was telling the truth and ordered the arrest of Miss Elizabeth Jeffries and Mr. John Swan. Once arrested, they were charged with the murder of Mr. Joseph Jeffries. They were then held in the prison at Chelmsford until their trial. However, the sittings at the Chelmsford Assizes had already finished for the season and would not start again until March the following year. The trial eventually began on the 10th of March 1752 in front of Justice Wright. There had been much talk of the murder, and there was a great amount of public interest in the case, so the courtroom was packed. It was known that an overcrowded courtroom could lead to the spread of disease. At one sessions in London in 1750, there had been an outbreak of what was commonly known at the time as jail fever, but was really typhus, and had led to the deaths of 60 people, including the Lord Mayor and 2 judges. Due to this, aromatic herbs were scattered throughout the court to keep down the smell and prevent the spread of infection. John Swan stood trial on the charge of petty treason for the wicked murder of his master, while Elizabeth was charged with aiding, helping, assisting, comforting and maintaining John Swan to commit the murder. Both defendants pleaded not guilty. The principal witness was Mr. Thomas Matthews, but the prosecution were able to produce a number of witnesses, all who testified against both Elizabeth Jeffries and John Swan. Servants who had been employed by Mr. Joseph Jeffries told of how the once quite cordial gentleman had become increasingly more temperamental, and significantly more so, since it was known that his niece had been courting young gentlemen, even though this was never mentioned in the house. Elizabeth's behaviour had resulted in Mr. Jeffries considering changing his will in favour of someone other than his niece. It was also mentioned that people had long since thought that John Swan had a grudge against his master and would not have been at all sad when the old man eventually drew his last breath. Despite the large number of witnesses for the prosecution, there were those who spoke in Elizabeth's defence and told of how kind and attentive Elizabeth had always been towards her uncle. During the proceedings, there were periods when Elizabeth became quite emotional and fainted. The trial lasted 19 hours, and when the jury returned to deliver their verdict, they found both the defendants guilty. On hearing the verdict, Miss Jeffries began to weep. 2 days later, Mr. Swan and Miss Jeffries returned to court to hear the judge pass sentence. They were both sentenced to death. While awaiting her execution, Elizabeth exchanged letters with another young lady who had also been sentenced to death named Miss Mary Blandy. She had been convicted for poisoning her father. Elizabeth and Mary were both well-educated young ladies, and it seemed very strange that both had found themselves in such terrible circumstances. In the evening of the 27th of March 1752, just one day before her execution, Elizabeth made a full confession. She told of how she and John had planned the crime, and that Thomas Matthews did not participate in any of it. The following morning, they were taken to the gallows. Elizabeth travelled in a cart, riding on her own coffin, while John was dragged on a sledge, as he had been convicted for the greater crime of petty treason. They were accompanied on this journey, that was some 23 miles, by soldiers and the under-sheriff of Essex. When they reached the gallows, John Swan stood on the cart, while Elizabeth, being much smaller at just over 5 foot, was made to stand on a chair that was placed on top of the cart. Neither was blindfolded. Instead, they looked on at the very large and noisy crowd, which was estimated to be over 7,000 people, all of who had come to watch them hang. Neither Elizabeth or John looked at each other during this time. When the horses moved forward, the cart was taken from under them. After they were hanged, both bodies were taken down. The body of Elizabeth was given to friends for burial, while the body of John was placed in chains and put on display for a few days, in the hope that it would deter other criminals from committing crime. Hello everybody, and thank you so much for listening. During this case I mentioned Miss Mary Blandy, and this was a case that I covered a few years ago. If any of you would like to hear it again, I've left a link below. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case